High Point Mansion sits on a hill overlooking the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, a town that exists entirely because one man willed it into existence. The 22-room Mediterranean Revival Mansion is beautiful, perfectly preserved, and utterly empty of the children it was built for. It stands as a monument to the most successful failure in American business history. A man who built a chocolate empire, created a utopian company town, and established one of the wealthiest charitable institutions in America, all because he couldn't have the one thing he actually wanted, a child of his own. This is the story of Milton Hershey, the man who turned chocolate from a luxury into America's comfort food. But it's also the story of how philanthropy can be a response to personal tragedy, how a company town can be both paradise and prison, and how the absence of an heir can shape a legacy in ways more profound than the presence of one ever could. Milton Hershey died in 1945 with no children, no direct heirs, and a fortune that would eventually be worth billions. High Point Mansion, built for a family that never materialized, became the physical embodiment of his greatest failure and his most lasting achievement. Milton Snavely Hershey was born in 1857 in rural Pennsylvania to a family that was, to put it charitably, dysfunctional. His father, Henry, was a dreamer and a failure, constantly chasing get-rich-quick schemes, moving the family from place to place, investing in ventures that collapsed, leaving his wife Fanny to hold the family together through sheer determination. Young Milton got almost no formal education. He attended school sporadically, never progressing beyond 4th grade, because his father kept moving the family or pulling him out to help with some new doomed business venture. By the time Milton was 14, his parents had essentially separated, and his mother was raising him alone in poverty. Fanny apprenticed Milton to a printer, hoping he'd learn a useful trade. He was fired within a year. She then apprenticed him to a candy maker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And there, finally, Milton Hershey found his calling. For 4 years, he learned the candy trade, how to make caramels, how to work with sugar, how to manage production. At 19, with $150 borrowed from his aunt, he opened his own candy shop in Philadelphia. It failed within 6 years. He tried again in Chicago. Failed. Tried in New Orleans. Failed. Tried in New York. Failed spectacularly, going deeply into debt. By 1886, at age 28, Milton Hershey was a serial failure living in his mother's basement. His father's patterns seemed to be repeating. Constant entrepreneurial attempts, constant failures, growing debt, and diminishing prospects. Most people would have given up. But Hershey tried again. This time, he returned to Lancaster and started the Lancaster Caramel Company with yet another loan, this time from a bank that probably shouldn't have given it to him. But Hershey had learned something from all his failures. Quality mattered. He made caramels using fresh milk instead of the paraffin most candy makers used. The product was better, noticeably better, and it sold. Within 3 years, the Lancaster Caramel Company was successful. Within 5 years, it was making Hershey wealthy. Within 10 years, he sold it for $1 million, equivalent to about $35 million today. At 43, Milton Hershey was a millionaire, and for the first time in his life, financially secure. But he wasn't satisfied. Caramels had made him rich, but he had become obsessed with something he'd seen at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair: German chocolate-making equipment. Chocolate was a luxury in America, expensive and mainly imported. Hershey believed he could make it affordable, could mass-produce it, could turn chocolate from a treat for the wealthy into something every American could enjoy. In 1900, he sold the Caramel Company entirely and bet everything on chocolate. His friends and associates thought he was insane, giving up a proven, profitable business for an untested gamble. But Hershey had a vision, and the failures of his youth had taught him persistence. The same year Hershey committed to chocolate, he married Catherine Sweeney, called Kitty. She was a woman from a Catholic family in Jamestown, New York. Milton was 42, Kitty was 25. By all accounts, he loved her deeply, perhaps the one genuine, uncomplicated relationship in his life. Kitty was everything Milton wasn't: educated, cultured, sophisticated. She spoke French, played piano, read literature. She brought grace and refinement to Milton's life. And she desperately wanted children. They tried for years. No children came. In that era, There was no real understanding of fertility issues, no treatment, just disappointment and shame. Kitty blamed herself. Milton likely blamed himself. The silence around infertility in early 1900s America meant they suffered alone, with no explanation for why the family they wanted so badly wouldn't happen. The absence of children shaped everything that followed. Without heirs, Milton began thinking differently about his fortune. Without a son to inherit the business, he started building something else, a legacy that would outlive him in ways a biological heir never could. In 1903, Hershey broke ground on his chocolate factory in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, in the middle of farmland he had purchased. The choice of location was deliberate. He wanted access to fresh milk from local dairy farms. He wanted land cheap enough to build extensively, and he wanted to be away from existing cities with their labor problems and unions. But Hershey didn't just build a factory. He built a town. From the very beginning, his vision was to create a complete community. Workers would have homes, schools, churches, parks, entertainment. It would be a model community, proving that capitalism could be benevolent, that a company could make profits while treating workers well. The cynical interpretation is that Hershey was building the ultimate company town, a place where he controlled everything, where workers were dependent on him for employment, housing, and services, where unions would be unnecessary because Hershey took care of his workers. And there's truth to this interpretation. Company towns had a dark history in America of exploitation and control. But there's also evidence that Hershey genuinely believed in what he was building. He had grown up poor. He had failed repeatedly. He knew what insecurity felt like. And now that he had money and power, he seemed determined to use it differently than most industrialists of his era. The town of Hershey was designed with unusual care. Streets were wide and tree-lined. Workers' homes had indoor plumbing and electricity, rare luxuries in 1905. There were parks, a public swimming pool, a sports arena, a theater. The center of town wasn't dominated by the factory or mansion. It was Hershey Park, an amusement park where workers and their families could enjoy themselves. It was paternalistic capitalism at its finest. Hershey gave his workers a good life, and in exchange, they gave him their loyalty and labor. It was better than most workers had anywhere else in America. It was also a gilded cage that Hershey controlled completely. But as Hershey was building his town, his personal life was quietly falling apart. Kitty had developed a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't adequately diagnose or treat. She experienced severe muscle weakness, tremors, and progressive paralysis. Modern doctors looking at the historical records believe she had a degenerative neurological disease, possibly multiple sclerosis or a similar condition. There was no cure. There was barely any treatment. Hershey watched his wife slowly lose the ability to walk, then to care for herself. By 1910, Kitty was largely bedridden and required constant care. Milton was 53, wealthy beyond imagination, building a model town, and watching the woman he loved die by inches. He responded by throwing himself even more intensely into building Hershey, Pennsylvania. If he couldn't have a family, he would build a community. If he couldn't have children, he would create something that would outlive him. The town became his child, the workers his dependents, the whole enterprise a substitute for the family he couldn't have. In 1908, Hershey founded the Hershey Industrial School, initially for orphan boys. The school would provide education, trade training, and housing for children who had no families. The timing is significant. This was when Kitty's illness was becoming severe, when it was clear they would never have children of their own. The school was Hershey's answer to childlessness. If he couldn't raise his own children, he would raise other people's children. He endowed it generously, built housing and classrooms, and established it as a permanent institution. Later, after Kitty's death, he would give the school the controlling interest in the Hershey Chocolate Company, making orphans the primary beneficiaries of his fortune. Construction on High Point Mansion began in 1908, the same year as the orphan school. The house was designed in the Mediterranean Revival style, with stucco walls, a red tile roof, and elegant proportions. It had 22 rooms, formal gardens, and a commanding view of the town and factory below. But here's the heartbreaking detail. High Point was designed as a family home. The floor plan included multiple bedrooms, clearly meant for children. There was a nursery. There was a playroom. Milton was building a mansion for the family he would never have, for the children who would never exist. Kitty was already seriously ill when construction began. She would never really live in High Point in any meaningful sense. By the time it was completed, she was too sick to enjoy it. Milton would rattle around in this large house, built for children's laughter that never came, while his wife deteriorated in one of the bedrooms. The mansion that was supposed to be a symbol of Hershey's success became a monument to his loss. Every empty bedroom was a reminder. Every unused playroom was an accusation. High Point was a beautiful prison where Milton Hershey lived with his grief and his dying wife. Kitty Hershey died in 1915 at age 43. The cause was listed as muscular atrophy, though the underlying disease was never definitively diagnosed. She had been progressively paralyzed for years, had suffered immensely, and Milton had watched helplessly as she faded. Her death broke something in Milton Hershey. He was 58 years old, enormously wealthy, the founder of a thriving company in town, and completely alone. No wife, no children, no direct family to speak of. Just money, workers who depended on him, orphans he supported, and an enormous house he had built for a family that never existed. After Kitty's death, Milton threw himself into the orphan school with obsessive intensity. In 1918, he transferred the controlling shares of the Hershey Chocolate Company to the Hershey Trust, which funded the school. This was an astonishing act of philanthropy. He gave away control of his company while he was still alive, ensuring that orphans will be the primary beneficiaries of the chocolate empire's profits. But it was also an act of substitution. The orphan boys became the children he never had. The school became his family. He visited constantly, knew many of the boys by name, followed their progress obsessively. He had rules for everything: how they should dress, what they should study, what values they should hold. He was father to hundreds of boys, controlling their lives with the same paternalistic benevolence he showed his workers. This raises uncomfortable questions about Hershey's motivations. Was his philanthropy genuine altruism, or was it about control? Was he helping orphans, or was he creating dependents who would venerate him? Was the school about the boys' welfare, or about giving meaning to Milton's childless life? The answer is probably all of the above. Human motivations are complex. Hershey genuinely wanted to help disadvantaged children. His own difficult childhood had made him sympathetic to their plight. But he also needed them. He needed the purpose they gave him, the family structure they provided, the legacy they represented. The orphan school gave Hershey something to live for after Kitty died. But it also gave him hundreds of children to control, to shape, to make in his own image. He had absolute power over their lives. What they ate, wore, studied, believed. It was benevolent in intent, but it was still absolute control. Former students later describe a life of rigid discipline and constant supervision. Every aspect of their day was scheduled. Rules governed everything from how they made their beds to what they could read. Infractions were punished. Independence was discouraged. They were being trained to be grateful, obedient, and industrious. Perfect workers for Hershey's factory, which many of them eventually became. It was better than being in an abusive home or on the streets. The boys received education, health care, shelter, and opportunity they might never have had otherwise. But it was also a form of benevolent authoritarianism that shaped every aspect of their lives. Meanwhile, the town of Hershey continued to grow, and with it, the complications of paternalistic control. Hershey owned virtually everything: the factory, the homes workers rented, the stores where they shopped, the utilities they used, the amusement park where they relaxed. He set the wages, the rents, the prices. He decided what businesses could operate in town. He controlled the local newspaper. It was a form of private government that gave Hershey enormous power over people's lives. And while he generally used that power benevolently, wages were good, housing was decent, amenities were excellent. It was still autocratic control that allowed no dissent. Workers who complained could be fired and evicted. Business owners who didn't follow Hershey's vision could be shut out. The town prospered, but only as long as everyone accepted Hershey's complete authority. It was enlightened despotism, emphasis on both enlightened and despotism. During the Great Depression, Hershey's company town model proved its worth. While unemployment devastated most of America, Hershey kept his workers employed. He couldn't afford to maintain full production, so he started massive building projects, a hotel, a community center, expanded sports facilities. It was make work, designed to keep people employed rather than producing necessary goods. But it worked. The town of Hershey survived the Depression better than almost anywhere in America. This cemented Hershey's reputation as a benevolent employer and reinforced workers' loyalty. But it also deepened their dependence. Hershey wasn't just their employer. He was their benefactor, their protector, the man who stood between them and poverty. How could they challenge someone who had saved them? Labor organizers tried repeatedly to unionize Hershey's workers in the 1930s. The workers themselves resisted, largely because they feared losing the paternalistic protection Hershey provided. A brief strike in 1937 was violently broken up by loyalist workers who attacked the strikers. Hershey himself was conflicted. He believed he treated workers fairly and that unions were unnecessary, but he was also hurt that anyone would challenge his benevolence. The town had become a strange hybrid, genuinely prosperous and well-maintained, but also controlled by a single individual who couldn't be challenged. It was utopia with a dictator, a benevolent one, but a dictator nonetheless. High Point Mansion, meanwhile, remained largely empty. Milton lived there alone except for servants, rattling around in rooms designed for a large family. He never remarried. Kitty had been his only love, and he seemed to have no interest in replacing her. He never adopted children, though he had hundreds of orphans in his school. He remained fundamentally alone despite being surrounded by people who depended on him. Visitors to High Point described it as beautiful but cold, perfectly maintained but unlived in. Milton used some rooms, his bedroom, his study, but most of the house sat unused. The nursery remained empty. The children's bedrooms were furnished, but unoccupied. It was like a museum of the life Hershey had planned, but never lived. He spent much of his time at the mansion working, planning the town's expansion, monitoring the orphan school, managing the chocolate company. Work was his substitute for family, his distraction from loneliness, his way of giving meaning to a life that felt incomplete. Former employees remember him as distant and formal, generous but not warm. He would know facts about workers' lives, who had children, who was struggling, but he didn't have personal friendships in any real sense. His relationships were all transactional, employer to employee, benefactor to recipient, patriarch to dependent. This wasn't cruelty. It was the result of a life shaped by loss and disappointment. Hershey had learned not to get too close to people. His father had been unreliable. His marriage had ended in tragedy. He had no children to love unconditionally. So he built walls, maintained distance, and expressed care through financial generosity rather than emotional connection. The town of Hershey was his masterpiece and his substitute for the family he couldn't have. Every street, every building, every amenity was an expression of the love and control he would have exercised over children if he'd had them. The workers were his dependents, the orphans his wards, the whole enterprise of family with him as its distant, benevolent patriarch. As Hershey aged, the question of succession became critical. Who would control the chocolate company and the trust after he died? He had structured things so that the orphan school owned the majority stake in the company. But who would manage that trust? Who would run the company? Who would maintain his vision for the town? Hershey grappled with this throughout the 1930s and 40s. He was building a legacy that would outlive him, but he couldn't completely control what happened after his death. The thought tormented him. What if future trustees betrayed his vision? What if the orphan school was mismanaged? What if the town was sold off or the company merged away? He tried to address these fears through increasingly specific trust documents and operating rules. He spelled out exactly how the orphan school should be run, what values it should teach, even what food the boys should eat. He created structures meant to preserve his control from beyond the grave. But he couldn't control everything, and he knew it. The orphan school would survive him. It does to this day, now called the Milton Hershey School, one of the wealthiest charitable institutions in America. But it wouldn't be his anymore. It would belong to the future, to trustees and administrators who never knew him, to students who would learn about him in history classes rather than seeing him visit their dorms. Milton Hershey died on October 13, 1945, at age 88. He died in High Point Mansion, in the house he had built for the family he never had. His funeral was attended by thousands of workers, orphans, and townspeople who genuinely mourned him. Whatever his flaws, he had created something unprecedented, a profitable company that funded philanthropy, a town that provided genuine prosperity to workers, a school that gave opportunities to disadvantaged children. But he died alone, with no wife, no children, no direct heirs. The enormous fortune he had built would go to orphans through the trust. The town would continue, but under management he couldn't control. The company would survive and thrive, but it wouldn't be his anymore. After Hershey's death, High Point Mansion was maintained by the trust, but largely unused. It was too expensive and impractical for any single person or family to occupy. For decades, it sat mostly empty, occasionally used for special events or meetings, beautifully preserved but fundamentally purposeless. In some ways, this was fitting. The house had always been more symbol than home, more monument than residence. It was built for a family that never existed, occupied by a man who lived there alone, and it continued that pattern of beautiful emptiness after his death. Today, High Point is owned by the Milton Hershey School and is used for official events, fundraisers, and occasionally as a museum space. Visitors can tour some of the rooms and see how Milton Hershey lived. The guides tell you about his philanthropy, his business success, the town he built. They mention Kitty's death, but usually quickly, treating it as a sad footnote rather than the defining tragedy that shaped everything else. What they don't emphasize is the loneliness that permeates the house, the empty children's bedrooms, the nursery that was never used, the formal dining room set for dinner parties Hershey rarely hosted, the library filled with books he didn't have time to read. Every room a reminder of absence, of what wasn't there rather than what was. The town of Hershey survived its founder and continues to this day. It's no longer a company town in the strictest sense. The trust doesn't own everything anymore, and there's more independence than during Milton's lifetime. But the town is still dominated by the Hershey Company and the Milton Hershey School. The chocolate factory is still the largest employer. The school is still the wealthiest institution. The Hershey name is still on everything. It's a strange place, Hershey, Pennsylvania, genuinely prosperous and well-maintained, but also fundamentally artificial. It exists because one man willed it into existence as a substitute for the family he couldn't have. Every street is named after something related to chocolate. Chocolate Avenue, Cocoa Avenue. The streetlights are shaped like Hershey kisses. It's charming and also slightly unsettling. A town that's a monument to one man's vision and loss. The Milton Hershey School is perhaps the most complicated part of his legacy. Today, it has assets of over $17 billion, making it one of the wealthiest charitable institutions in America. It provides full scholarships, housing, and support to about 2,000 students from low-income families. Graduates have access to opportunities they would never have had otherwise. But the school has also faced criticism over the years for being too wealthy, too controlling, and too focused on maintaining the trust rather than helping as many children as possible. With $17 billion in assets supporting 2,000 students, the school spends an average of about $100,000 per student per year, an extraordinary amount that raises questions about whether the money could be used more efficiently. There have been lawsuits from former students alleging abuse and mistreatment. There have been controversies about admission policies and who gets to attend. There have been accusations that the school is more interested in preserving its wealth than in fulfilling Milton Hershey's vision. These criticisms may or may not be fair, but they raise important questions. What would Milton Hershey think of what his school has become? Would he be proud of the billions in assets, or would he argue they should be spent helping more children? Would he approve of the current policies and practices, or would he see them as betrayals of his vision? We can't know. Hershey has been dead for nearly 80 years. The world has changed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The trust has evolved according to interpretations of his wishes by people who never knew him. His legacy is being carried forward by strangers, which is exactly what he feared and exactly what was inevitable when you die without heirs. The Hershey Company itself has also evolved far beyond anything Milton Hershey would recognize. It's now a multi-billion-dollar global corporation, publicly traded, making products he never conceived of. The Milton Hershey School Trust still owns a significant stake in the company, making the school one of the largest shareholders. But the company is run by professional managers with no connection to Hershey the man. There have been multiple attempts over the years to sell the Hershey Company or merge it with larger corporations. Each time, the proposed sales have been blocked by community opposition and complex trust arrangements that Milton Hershey set up to prevent exactly this scenario. Even from the grave, he's still exerting control, still trying to preserve his vision, still fighting to keep the company and school connected. But control from beyond the grave is imperfect at best. The company makes decisions based on modern business practices, not Milton Hershey's values. The school operates according to current educational theory, not Hershey's early 1900s ideas about child rearing. The town has changed, grown, become something different for what he built. This is the inevitable fate of any legacy. It gets reinterpreted, modified, and eventually transformed into something the original creator wouldn't fully recognize. Hershey tried to prevent this through legal structures and detailed instructions, but he could only delay the inevitable. The world moves on. The living adapt to changing circumstances. The dead lose their grip, slowly but inexorably. There's a statue of Milton Hershey in the town that bears his name. It shows him with several of his orphan schoolboys, smiling, paternal, surrounded by the children he never had biologically, but supported philanthropically. It's a lovely statue, and it captures how Hershey wanted to be remembered, as a benefactor, a father figure, a man who used his wealth to help others. But it also captures the tragedy at the heart of his story. Those boys weren't his children. They were a substitute, a replacement for what he actually wanted. He loved them, probably, in his distant way. He certainly provided for them generously. But they were never really his family, never filled the emptiness left by childlessness. The statue represents both Hershey's greatest achievement and his deepest loss. He built something that helped thousands of children and continues to help them today. But he did it because he couldn't have children of his own, because his wife died young, because his life didn't turn out the way he had hoped. And that's the story of High Point Mansion and the Hershey fortune. Great achievement born from profound loss. Philanthropy emerging from personal tragedy, a legacy created because the natural legacy of children was impossible. Milton Hershey is remembered as one of the good robber barons, one of the industrialists who actually cared about his workers and used his wealth responsibly. And compared to Rockefeller, Carnegie, or Ford, that's probably fair. He genuinely tried to be better than his peers. He really did create a model town and a lasting charitable institution. But he also built a company town where he controlled every aspect of life. He ran an orphan school with rigid discipline and little room for independence. He created structures designed to maintain his control long after his death. His benevolence always came with strings attached, with expectations of gratitude and obedience. And all of it, the town, the school, the philanthropy, the control, came from the same source. A childless man trying to create a family. A lonely widower trying to fill an unfillable void, a successful businessman who had failed at the one thing that mattered most to him. High Point Mansion still sits on its hill, overlooking the town Milton Hershey built. The chocolate factory is still running, now producing billions of Hershey bars, Reese's cups, and kisses every year. The Milton Hershey School is still educating disadvantaged children. The town still bears his name, the streets still shaped like his vision. But the man is gone. And with him, the living connection to why all of this exists. High Point is just a building now, maintained by a trust, used for events, visited by tourists who take pictures and learn about chocolate. The children's bedrooms are empty, always have been empty, and always will be. The nursery that was never used, the playroom where no children played, the family home where no family lived, all of it perfectly preserved, all of it beautiful, all of it tragically empty. That's the real story of High Point Mansion and the Hershey fortune. Not a story of greed or exploitation like so many robber baron estates, but a story of loss and substitution, of building monuments to replace what can't be replaced, of creating a legacy because creating a family wasn't possible. Milton Hershey got almost everything he wanted. He built a successful company, created a model town, established a lasting charitable institution. He died wealthy, respected, and genuinely mourned by thousands of people whose lives he had improved. But he never got the one thing he wanted most, children of his own, a family to fill High Point Mansion, a wife who lived to grow old with him. All his success, all his philanthropy, all his achievement was compensation for that fundamental absence. And so High Point stands, beautiful, perfectly maintained, and utterly empty. A monument to the family that never was, built by a man who created thousands of surrogate families because he couldn't have his own. The house that chocolate built but grief designed. The tragedy of Milton Hershey isn't that he failed. It's that he succeeded at everything except the one thing that mattered. And all the chocolate in the world, all the grateful orphans, all the prosperity he created, none of it could fill the empty nursery and house on the hill.